Welcome to the Financial Aid webinar. My name is Jason Elliott. I'm the Associate Dean for Financial Assistance here at Richmond University. And for the next few minutes, we're just going to be doing like a brief overview of the financial aid process. And I will also mention that at the end of the presentation, there will be some opportunities to ask questions. So if you do have any questions, please feel free to type your questions, and then I will answer the questions at the end of the presentation. Just to understand the process, broadly speaking, most of our students do get their funding through scholarships and through FAFSA loans. Most of our American students through scholarships, through FAFSA loans, which is the free application for federal student aid, which is the US government federal loans, and also private loans. So generally, most of our students fund their studies through these various avenues. In terms of private loans, I will mention that the only option available for private loans for US students studying abroad is through Sallie Mae. And some years back, several banks in the US used to provide loans to American students studying abroad. But currently, Sallie Mae is the only private provider for private loans to US students studying abroad. So if you're thinking about using private loans, please keep in mind that Sallie Mae currently is the only provider, the only financial institution in the States that do provide private loans to US students studying abroad. And most of you might already be familiar with FAFSA, but FAFSA is the main application that you have to use to apply for federal loans. And I will also mention, it's probably later in the presentation, but I will mention also at this juncture that our FAFSA code is G10594. So if you're submitting a FAFSA application, you have to include Richmond University's code, which is G10594. And even before I proceed, I will also mention on the question of FAFSA that if you are in the States, if you're studying in the States, you could access federal loans and what's called federal grants. The grants, of course, are the category of funding by the US government that is not to be repaid after you complete your studies. For example, Pell Grants is classified as a grant, and that has to do with after the federal government does means testing. And so if you're studying in the States, you could access federal loans and federal grants. But I will emphasize that if you're studying outside the US and you decide to travel overseas and you're traveling outside the US to study, it is a very strict federal law that you're not allowed to use the Pell Grants or any other federal grants. So therefore, attending Richmond University or any other university outside the United States, you can only access federal loans. So please, please keep that in mind as you're proceeding with the process. And I'll continue as well on the next. And generally, in terms of the scholarships, we do have for example, these are just some examples of scholarships that are offered through the admissions office. The Chancellor Scholarship, which is $19,000. The Presidential, as an example, $17,100. And the GI Bill. Now, if you apply, since you're applying as a new student, the scholarships are awarded directly from the admissions office after they've reviewed your application, and they will use the various criteria in order to award you the scholarship. So if you do have any specific questions regarding scholarships, or if you applied and you're trying to follow up, please feel free to contact the admissions office directly, because the admissions office are responsible for awarding scholarships to new applicants. The one thing I will mention about the scholarships, once you're awarded a scholarship from the admissions office, please make note of the requirements in order to maintain the scholarships. So for example, the presidential scholarship might say you have to maintain a GPA. Once you're enrolled as a student, you have to maintain a GPA of 3.4 as an example. You have to take note that you are aware of the requirements that you have to meet in order to maintain the scholarships. Because once you're an enrolled student, I will be in touch with you, and I will be coordinating with you to make sure that you continue to meet your requirements in order to maintain the scholarships. As a side note, if, for example, you have an academic-based scholarship that require, let me say, a GPA of a 3.4, and you fall below that particular GPA, you will be given 1 semester to increase the GPA, and even possibly at my discretion, you could get a further extension to that, what we'll call a scholarship probation, in order to improve on your GPA. So you do not automatically lose your scholarship if you fail to meet the requirements for academic-based scholarships. And we do have a scholarship for GI Bill students, and these are veteran students. These are students who are getting funding through the Department of Veterans Affairs. And we will probably speak a little bit about veterans funding later in the presentation. And of course, most of you might already be aware of the US government website, FAFSA.ed.gov. I will also briefly mention that once you submit your FAFSA, it does take approximately a week to 10 days for us to receive the electronic report of your FAFSA. And generally, once we receive your FAFSA, we have to evaluate your FAFSA and then issue what's called a loan award letter. That loan award letter basically gives you further instructions on what you need to do in order to continue with the loan application process, because the application of federal loans do have various dimensions. So for example, submitting the FAFSA is just the very first step of the process. Then we'll issue a loan award letter giving you further instructions on what you need to do in order to complete the process. Just submitting a FAFSA application is not a commitment to a loan, or is not a commitment that you want to receive funding from the US government. In order to fully commit yourself, you have to actually go a step further after receiving our loan application letter. For example, you have to go to studentloans.gov, you have to sign the master promissory note. You also have to sign a document that will issue to you in order for you to complete the process. And your parents, if you're a dependent student receiving the Parents Plus loan, your parents also have to complete some other aspects of the application, such as a master promissory note. But the loan award letter will give you further details in terms of what you would need to do in order to complete the process. And we do have some students who have dual nationality. So for example, they might be US students, and then they might also be British citizens or residents. And if you're receiving a loan from the US government, it does not stop you or prohibit you from receiving loans from the UK government. We do have a small pool of students who do get loans from the US and then get loans from the UK. But if you're a dual national, for example, if you're a UK citizen or resident and you do have any questions regarding the UK loan application process, or whether you do qualify for UK loans, please feel free to contact me. I can discuss that in more details with you, even though we're not going into the nitty-gritty details of UK loans in this particular presentation. But if you do have a UK passport and you're a UK resident and you want to explore the possibility of getting funding in the United Kingdom, please feel free to contact me and we can discuss it further. And as I mentioned earlier, our code is G10594. And once you enter that, we'll receive the electronic version of your FAFSA, and then we'll issue a loan award letter. Now we have received a number of 1819 FAFSA applications, and in the coming days, we'll start issuing the loan award letter. So if you have already been admitted, These loan award letters, I will also mention that they are issued to students who have already been admitted. So if your application is pending, we'll wait until you've been formally accepted before we actually issue the loan award letter. But very soon, in the coming days, we'll start issuing the loan award letter. So please keep an eye out for that, and then also feel free to coordinate with the admissions, with our US admissions office, if you want to follow up on that. And that letter, you can receive it, you'll receive it by mail, but then the admissions office can also email an electronic version of the letter. Now, in terms of going into a little bit of details regarding the categories of loans, broadly speaking, as an undergraduate student, you can access, and you're a dependent undergraduate student. Now, undergraduate students generally will fall either on the dependent category or the independent category. So if you're an independent student, you have to be, for example, if you're above 24 years old, you're married as an example, then you are automatically classified as an independent student. If you have dependents, you're qualified as an independent student. So if you're above 24 years old, you're married as an example, you will automatically be qualified as an independent student. Now, if you're an independent student, your parents cannot apply for the Parents Plus loan, because the Parents Plus loan is only for dependent students. So if you're an independent student, you can only access what's called the Subsidized Unsubsidized direct loan. So if you're an independent student, you can only access the Subsidized Unsubsidized and loans. And the unsubsidized, subsidized loans for independent students is slightly higher than those of dependent students. So for example, if you're a first-year independent student, you can receive a maximum of $9,500 total in terms of subsidized, unsubsidized. Whereas if you are a dependent student, your subsidized, unsubsidized as a first-year student will be $5,500. So if you're an independent student, your parents cannot apply for the Parents Plus loan, which means that, and of course, if you're planning to attend Richmond, even with your university scholarships, you will realize that and if you're an independent student, even with your university scholarships, you will realize that you will need a bit more funding, because just the loan will not be enough as an independent student, because you cannot access the Parents Plus loan. In that particular case, you're probably going to be looking at Sallie Mae, which they provide, as I mentioned before, they provide private loans. So we do have a number of independent students, and they usually top up their funding by Sallie Mae loans. But on the issue of dependent students, they could access the subsidized, unsubsidized. So if you're a first-year student, you can get a maximum of $5,500. If you're a second-year student, you get $6,500. And if you're a third or fourth-year student, you get $7,500. And that is for the entire academic year. And any other amount you need above that to cover your accommodation cost, your living expenses, because the US governments do have a broad allowance of funds available to cover everything that you need for your educational studies. Even if you're looking at going back home for vacation and things like that, can all be classified under your federal loans. But the loan award letter will give you sort of a maximum amount. What we call the cost of attendance will be provided through the loan application letter. But basically, any other amount you need above the subsidized, unsubsidized to cover your funding level will have to come under the Parents Plus loan. And one of the differences between the loans is that the subsidized, unsubsidized direct loan will be under the name of the student. So the subsidized, unsubsidized loan will be under your name. And then the Parents Plus is under the name of your parent. And Another important difference in terms of the loan categories, the subsidized, unsubsidized loan, which is under your name, under the name of the student, is not subject to a credit check, which means you simply qualify for the subsidized, unsubsidized loan based on your US citizenship or residency. And as long as you have not gone over the maximum amounts, because there's some maximum amounts for your entire undergraduate studies. A lot of students don't exhaust it anyway, but that, just for reference purposes, that maximum amount for undergraduate students would be 31,000. But as long as you've not gone over that, generally it would be approved without any complication. So the subsidized, unsubsidized loan is not subject to a credit check. That is simply based on US citizenship, residency. And when we speak about the term subsidized, now the loan award letter that we issue will specifically break down the category that is subsidized and the category of the loan that is unsubsidized. So for example, first year undergraduate student, 5,500 will be your maximum. And then based on the FAFSA information that we received and based on the calculations outlined through regulations, through federal regulations, the letter will be able to do the calculation and be able to tell you which portion will be subsidized and which portion will be unsubsidized. So for example, in the loan award letter, we might say something like 3,500 is subsidized and 2,000 is unsubsidized. Now, when we're using the term subsidized or unsubsidized, or when the federal government is using the term subsidized or unsubsidized, it basically means that there's a portion of the loan that does not accumulate. You don't have to pay the interest on that portion of the loan. So whilst you are enrolled in university, the government pays that portion, the interest of that portion. So if the letter says 3,500 is subsidized, the federal government pays the interest on the 3,500, whereas for the 2,000 that is unsubsidized, there will be an interest accumulating on that. So that's the main meaning of that term, subsidized, unsubsidized. And without getting too deep in the weeds of things, the major aspect behind the calculation of what is going to be subsidized and unsubsidized is based on the EFC. You know, at the end of when you submit your FAFSA, you do receive an EFC figure. And the whole idea behind the subsidized, unsubsidized is a need-based calculation, which means if you're deemed to be a high-need student, then there will be a higher portion of your loan subsidized. And then if you're a less need student, a lower portion would be unsubsidized, would be subsidized. And even in some cases, if the EFC is extremely high, 0 portion of the loan will be subsidized, means the entire loan will be unsubsidized. But I wouldn't get too details on that, too much information on that. But again, if you do have any questions, please feel free to type your questions and I can address that at the end of the presentation. And of course, students will start repaying the loan after you complete your studies. And whilst you are enrolled, you do not have to start repaying the subsidized, unsubsidized direct loan. Your parents will have to start doing some repayments, but you don't have to be repaying the subsidized, unsubsidized loan whilst you are enrolled as a student. And even after you complete your studies, you could defer your loan payments through the deferment process. Basically, the idea is that once you're enrolled as a student, you are not compelled to repay your loans. Having said that, you're at liberty at any time, and we do have some cases like that every year where students might opt to, for whatever reason, they might opt to start repaying their loans whilst they're enrolled as a student. So there's nothing stopping you from doing that, because some students apply for a high amount of loans at the start of the academic year, but then probably they're able to get employment here in the UK, on-campus employment. They're able to, and they end up realizing that they don't need all the funds they applied for. In those cases, you might either contact me so that I can do a reduction of the loan, but if you've been given the surplus out of the loan as a credit into your account, you're definitely at liberty to repay your loans back to the federal government. There's nothing prohibiting you from doing that. I will also quickly mention that the loans for the entire academic year, so the loans, for example, if a student starts in September, the loans will cover September to May as an example, covering the entire academic year. And that loan is divided into 2 disbursements. There will be a disbursement in September, and then there will be a disbursement in January. And then I will email you individually. I will email individual students when the loans arrive. And then that loan is automatically credited into your student account. And after the finance office deducts your tuition and any other charges, they usually give the student a credit. They'll give you the credits back as a refund. And the federal government expects you to use that credit for your personal expenses, books, maintenance, even entertainment, I would add. The one important point about the Parent Plus loan, the Parent Plus loan is subject to a credit check. The subsidized, unsubsidized loan, as I mentioned before, is simply based on citizenship, US residency. Whereas the Parent Plus loan, in addition to your parents being a US resident or citizen, there's also a credit check that has to be done every year. So your parents have to apply for the loan every year. And every year, the federal government does a credit check. The credit check that is done by the federal government on the Parent Plus loan is not as stringent, is not as strict as the credit check that is done through Salime, as an example, or through a banking or financial institution. The banks generally, if you're going to apply to a bank for a loan, they will do a very detailed credit check. The US government credit check is not as stringent as a bank credit check, but they will do a credit check. And one of the issues they look for in the credit check when they do a credit check on your parents' application is for what they call adverse credit history. So consistent late payment, bankruptcy, things like that. So they only look for very adverse issues on the credit report. And even hypothetically speaking, if your parents do get declined through the Parent Plus application, your parents are at liberty to, they are allowed to appeal. So they can actually submit an appeal application through studentloans.gov, and they can explain the reason for the adverse issues on the credit report. So just understanding that there's a credit check should not in any way dissuade or discourage your parents from actually pursuing the Parent Plus application. And we do have some students who do get funding from the US Department of Veterans Affairs. And one of the main documents we need in order to confirm funding through the US Department of Veterans Affairs is what is called the VA Certificate of Eligibility. And this is a document that is issued by the US Department of Veterans Affairs once you've applied for your funding and once they've approved your funding. And this document has all the information that we need in order to submit what we call an enrollment report to the US Department of Veterans Affairs every semester. So if you're a VA student applying for VA funding and you've been approved for VA funding, we need a copy. We don't necessarily need the original, but we do need a copy of your VA Certificate of Eligibility. And also, if you're going to be receiving the VA scholarship or the GI Bill scholarship that I mentioned at the start of the presentation, you are supposed to also present a copy, email a copy of this VA Certificate of Eligibility to the US Admissions Office so that they would know that you've been approved for funding, and that will make you also eligible to also receive the GI Bill scholarship. And generally, just broadly, students will fall under what we call the Chapter 33 or the Chapter 35, which is the Chapter 33, like the GI Bills funding, or the Dependent Education Assistance funding. So in terms of the Chapter 33 funding, the Veterans Affairs will pay a portion of your tuition. So every year they cap the figure. So that, for example, they will say $23,000, a maximum will be paid towards your tuition. And then we will have to submit the enrollment report to the VA, and the VA will pay up to a maximum of $23,000 as an example. And then the VA, the GI Bill scholarship that you receive from the admissions office, in most cases will help to cover the remaining balance, to cover the tuition. And one of the differences between the two, between Chapter 33 and Chapter 35, in the case of Chapter 35, it doesn't cover the tuition parts, but they do give a maintenance support that will be paid directly to the student. Whereas for the Chapter 33, they'll be able to pay tuition directly to the university, and then also the tuition will be able to, for the Chapter 33, they'll pay both tuition and maintenance, whereas Chapter 35 would just be simply maintenance. And also in terms of FAFSA, you might know that a couple of years ago, I believe, they made it possible so that students will be able to apply for FAFSA from October 1st. Instead, in previous years, you have to wait till January, but in October 1st, you could apply for your FAFSA, and then you could apply quite early, and then you can start the process quite early. You don't necessarily have to wait for January. I will just mention a couple of things. If you're an enrolled student at Richmond, I will usually send an email communication to all students, just giving them a gentle reminder of when the FAFSA application is open. And also you have to be submitting the FAFSA application every year. So it's a yearly requirement, you have to submit the FAFSA application. And one important thing about receiving loans through the federal government, through FAFSA, which is a very, very important point to note, is that there is something in the US law and in the US regulation that is called satisfactory academic progress, which basically means that if you're receiving loans from the federal government and if you're receiving FAFSA loans, you have to be making satisfactory academic progress. And if you're not making satisfactory academic progress, the US law does state that you will not be qualified for federal loans. And what does that mean practically speaking? Practically speaking, it means that if you're receiving federal loans through FAFSA, you have to maintain a minimum GPA of 2.0. A minimum GPA of 2.0, which it basically means that you have to be passing your classes at a minimum level. So after one semester, and we do monitor this very, very closely because it's a very, very strict federal regulation. So after one semester, if you do fall below a GPA of 2.0, then you'll be given an opportunity. You will receive a letter from me and a notification saying that you failed to meet your GPA requirement of 2.0. And then you'll be given another semester to increase your GPA. If at the end of that second semester, you fail to meet the GPA of 2.0, then you will lose your federal funding eligibility, which means you have to explore other ways, other funding avenues, like private loans as an example. But it's a very, very important requirement. But this particular GPA requirement, this maximum GPA criteria will also be stated in your loan application letter. So I will just, as a brief summary, just remind you, keep your eye out for the loan application letter. And once you receive the loan application letter, please read through the loan application letter very, very closely. And please follow the instructions on the loan application letter as well very closely once you receive the application letter. And there is some contact information from our US admissions office, where you can contact them directly if you do have any questions. And thank you for participating in the financial aid webinar. And if there are any questions, and I will answer if there are any questions. And please feel free to type any questions that you may have, and I will answer the questions if you do have any questions. If there are no questions, once again, thank you so much for participating in the financial aid webinar, and have a good day. Thank you.